Karen slapped my partner at a baby shower, didn't know the host was a judge. The invitation arrived in the form of a soft blue envelope, its elegant cursive writing nearly intimidating in its perfection. It was addressed to me and my partner, Riley, inviting us to a baby shower hosted by a friend of Riley's distant cousin. Normally, we wouldn't have bothered with such a formal affair, especially one connected through such a thin thread of relation. But Riley had recently rekindled contact with her cousin after years of estrangement, and this felt like a meaningful gesture, an olive branch extended and received with cautious hope. The shower was set to take place in the spacious garden of someone named Marla, a friend of the family, and as Riley's cousin explained, an older woman with a reputation for being fiercely intelligent, well-respected, and occasionally a little intimidating. She was described as elegant, but not stuck up, the kind of woman who wouldn't hesitate to put someone in their place if necessary, though she preferred diplomacy and a smile. On the morning of the event, Riley spent longer than usual getting ready, and I could tell she was nervous, although she wouldn't admit it. We had faced more than a few awkward stares and whispers at social gatherings in the past. Not everyone took kindly to a same-sex couple showing up with matching outfits and matching rings, even if their names were on the guest list. But Riley insisted this would be different, that her cousin had assured her it was a welcoming crowd, and besides, it wasn't about us. It was about the expecting couple. We picked out a thoughtful gift, wrapped it in soft pastel paper, and drove to the address listed on the invitation. The house was stunning, a sprawling estate that looked like it had been plucked from a magazine spread. Perfectly manicured hedges lined the long driveway, and tasteful decorations, streamers, balloons, and signs welcoming guests, guided us toward the back garden where the party was already in full swing. There were tables covered in white linen, trays of hors d'oeuvres arranged like artwork, and soft music playing from hidden speakers. The crowd was mixed, some young, some older, all dressed well and mingling in little groups. Riley's cousin, Marissa, spotted us quickly and pulled us into a warm hug, gushing over how happy she was to see us and how glad she was that we made it. For a moment, it felt like we had stepped into a dream, the kind of place where kindness flowed easily and no one gave a second thought to who you loved or how you dressed. Then Karen arrived. I didn't know her name at first, of course. All I saw was a woman in her mid-50s, platinum blonde hair styled into a stiff helmet of curls, lips pressed into a disapproving line as she surveyed the crowd like a queen inspecting her court. She wore a pale pink dress that matched the decorations, but there was nothing soft about her expression. From the moment she stepped onto the patio, I could feel the shift in energy, like someone had opened a window and let in a blast of cold air. Riley and I were seated at a table near the cake, laughing over a ridiculous baby name suggestion someone had made when I caught Karen's eyes on us. Not just a glance, a stare, prolonged and calculating, the kind that made your skin crawl. She didn't say anything at first. Instead, she made her way through the party like she owned it, greeting people with tight smiles and polite nods, lingering just a second too long near conversations that weren't meant for her. I saw her pause beside the expecting couple and fawn over the mother-to-be in a way that felt rehearsed, all while her eyes flicked to me and Riley every few moments, as if we were an itch she couldn't ignore. Wasn't long before the whispering started. Karen positioned herself near a group of older women and began speaking in a hushed but pointed tone, her voice just loud enough to carry. Phrases like "don't know who invited them" and "seems out of place" drifted our way, sharp and deliberate. Riley caught it too, her posture stiffened, and she gripped her champagne flute a little tighter. I placed my hand over hers, giving it a gentle squeeze, trying to anchor her. We had dealt with people like this before. We could rise above it. But Karen didn't stop. When Riley went to use the restroom, Karen made her move. She sauntered over, feigning a pleasant smile, and struck up small talk with me that barely masked her disdain. She asked me where I was from, what I did for a living, then casually dropped, "So, are you two sisters or?" Her voice trailed off, dripping with artificial innocence. When I told her that we were a couple, her eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and she said, "Oh, with a tone so frosty it could have frozen the garden roses. She excused herself shortly after, returning to her corner like a vulture circling for another pass. By the time Riley came back, her mood had changed. She whispered that Karen had cornered her near the powder room and made some comment about how not everyone appreciates public displays, despite Riley having done nothing more than adjust her necklace in the mirror. It was getting harder to ignore. The fun, the lightness of the event began to dull beneath the weight of Karen's scrutiny. We tried to focus on the games, the gifts, the laughter, but Karen always seemed to be lurking nearby, her gaze heavy on us, her words floating around like poison. Eventually, she stopped whispering and started talking louder, making sure people heard her. "Some people just don't know how to behave at respectable events," she said at one point, loud enough that several guests looked our way. The host, Marla, had been mostly quiet throughout, moving between groups and checking in with the expectant mother, but I noticed her eyes linger on Karen more than once. There was something unreadable in her expression, calm, collected, but with an edge that made me wonder if she had already made some kind of internal decision. We should have left. We should have taken the gift and our dignity and walked away, but Riley wanted to stay. She didn't want Karen to win. She didn't want the shadow of someone else's bigotry to take away a moment she had hoped would be healing, a reconnection with family, a celebration of life. So we stayed. We smiled. We clung to each other a little tighter and tried to let the warmth of the good people around us drown out the venom of one. But Karen wasn't finished. And neither was the host. Riley and I tried our best to blend back into the celebration, to pretend that the iciness of Karen's glares and the cutting words she kept lacing through conversations weren't affecting us, but it was like trying to ignore a leak in a roof during a rainstorm. No matter how much we tried to smile, to laugh politely at baby name games, or admire the adorable onesies being unwrapped by the glowing mom-to-be, Karen's presence loomed like a storm cloud. She hovered near enough to make us uncomfortable but far enough to avoid direct confrontation until she didn't. It began with comments that could have been passed off as poorly timed jokes or clumsy small talk, but there was always an edge to them. When someone complimented Riley's hair, Karen chimed in, "Yes, it's very alternative," with a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. When a group of us laughed over a story involving a same-sex couple raising twins, Karen muttered under her breath, "It's a shame what the world's coming to," and then quickly added, "Oh, I just meant society gotten so complicated." Her words were always cloaked in a veneer of plausible deniability, calculated and slippery like oil on water. But we weren't fools. We knew what she was doing. The worst part was how others started to react, or rather, how they didn't. There were people who noticed, who clearly picked up on Karen's hostility and the way her comments repeatedly targeted us, but they hesitated. Some gave us apologetic glances and quickly looked away. Others simply changed the subject or laughed awkwardly, like they didn't want to get involved. That silent complicity stung in ways I wasn't prepared for. I expected Karen's attitude. What I didn't expect was how isolating it would feel when no one stood up or said anything. Riley's cousin Marissa had disappeared into the gift-opening crowd and seemed oblivious to the tension unraveling just a few feet away. The couple being celebrated had their hands full with baby books and diapers, completely unaware that a social grenade was seconds from being pulled at their shower. The moment of escalation came during a toast. Marla, the host, had taken the mic and offered a short, eloquent speech filled with warmth and just the right balance of humor and sentiment. She toasted the parents-to-be, shared a story about them as kids, and then opened the floor for others to speak if they wished. That was when Karen, ever the opportunist, stepped forward. With the wine glass raised in her perfectly manicured hand, she began by praising the expectant couple, and then, somehow, made a hard left turn into family values, going on about how important it was for a child to grow up with proper role models, how certain modern lifestyles made that harder. Her words floated out across the garden with poisonous sweetness, and the subtext was so clear it might as well have been flashing in neon lights. I felt Riley tense beside me, her shoulders drawn tight, her eyes fixed on the rim of her glass as though willing herself not to react. But Karen wasn't finished. She stepped down, still smiling, and walked directly toward us, as if drawn by the scent of blood. She stood too close, her perfume strong and powdery, and looked at Riley with that same insincere grin. "You know, dear," she said, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, "some people just don't know their place. It's not your fault, of course. You're probably just confused. I'm sure you'll figure things out eventually." Riley blinked, stunned into silence, and I rose to my feet, my pulse pounding in my ears. "That's enough," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You've made your point. You don't like us, but you don't get to speak to her like that." Karen's smile vanished, replaced by a sneer. "Excuse me," she said, tone thick with mock offense. "Are you threatening me now? Is this how you people handle things?" She stepped even closer, her voice rising. "You're the reason gatherings like this are uncomfortable for the rest of us. Always pushing an agenda, always needing attention. You don't belong here." And then it happened. Riley, still seated, simply whispered, "Walk away." Her voice was so soft I almost missed it, but Karen didn't walk away. Instead, in a split-second motion that seemed unreal, she raised her hand and slapped Riley across the face. The sound echoed like a firecracker, silencing the entire party in an instant. It wasn't just the slap, it was the way it came out of nowhere, the violence of it, the brazenness. Riley's head turned sharply from the impact, and the tray of tiny pastel cupcakes she had been holding slipped from her lap and crashed to the ground, frosting splattering across the stone patio in soft pinks and blues. A collective gasp rose from the guests, mouths falling open, drinks forgotten, conversations suspended mid-sentence. One of the kids burst into tears. A glass shattered somewhere behind us. Karen stood there, chest heaving, as if expecting applause or at least support. But what she got instead was a deafening silence, broken only by the quiet, purposeful sound of heels clicking against the stone as Marla stepped forward from her place on the far side of the garden. She hadn't said a word until now. Her expression was unreadable, eyes calm but cold like the surface of a frozen lake. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand an explanation. She simply reached into her pocket, pulled out a phone, and said, "This is Judge Marla Sloan. I need courthouse security at my residence immediately." Karen's face twisted in confusion. "Excuse me," she said, laughing nervously. "You're calling security for what? That girl attacked me. I was defending myself." Marla didn't even look at her. She was still on the phone. "Yes, the incident occurred just now. Battery witnessed by no fewer than 20 people. My address is on file, thank you." Karen's mouth flapped open and closed like a fish, her voice trembling now. "Wait, you're a judge. You can't be serious." "I'm extremely serious," Marla said, hanging up and finally turning to face her. "And I suggest you don't move until they arrive." For the first time all afternoon, Karen looked scared. She stammered something unintelligible and backed away a few steps, as if expecting anyone to defend her. But no one did. The guests who had once pretended not to notice her cruelty now stood frozen, eyes wide, some beginning to film quietly with their phones. Others began whispering in low, urgent tones. The air had changed again, but this time it wasn't tension, it was a reckoning. Riley touched her cheek, where a faint red mark had begun to bloom. I crouched beside her, my voice shaking as I asked if she was okay. She nodded, still in shock, eyes glassy. And as I wrapped my arm around her, I looked up and saw Marla watching us, not with pity but with a quiet fury that simmered beneath her composed exterior. I could tell she had seen this kind of ugliness before, and I could tell she wasn't about to let it stand. The moments that followed were surreal, unfolding in slow motion as the stunned silence thickened around us like fog. Karen stood rooted to the spot, her smug veneer rapidly crumbling under the weight of her own actions. Her eyes darted left and right, scanning the stunned crowd as if searching for an ally, someone to swoop in and validate her version of events. But the guests stared back in quiet disbelief, their expressions ranging from shock to disgust. The slap had been clear, unprovoked, and entirely unjustified. There was no spinning it now, no twisting the narrative to paint herself as the victim. Several people were already holding up their phones, the soft whirring sound of cameras rolling making Karen visibly twitch. She lifted a shaky hand to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, an involuntary gesture that failed to mask the growing panic in her face. She opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to rationalize her behavior or to lash out again, but the sound of approaching footsteps cut through the tension like a razor. Marla stepped forward slowly, her expression unreadable, her hands folded neatly in front of her like she was about to deliver a closing statement in court. "Karen," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel, "you assaulted one of my guests. You escalated a situation that by every account and recording here you manufactured. You were given the opportunity to behave with basic human decency and you failed." There was no dramatic flair in her tone, no raised voice, just a chilling steadiness, the kind of calm that came from years of authority and control. Karen's face twisted into a petulant grimace. "I barely touched her," she snapped, her voice rising with desperation. "She provoked me. They shouldn't even be here. This is supposed to be a family event, not some circus." Her words, intended to stir support, instead hung in the air like a foul odor. Several guests visibly recoiled. A man near the punch table muttered, "Jesus," under his breath, while a woman holding a toddler turned and walked away, shaking her head. Marla didn't flinch. "I suggest you remain where you are," she said, reaching for her phone again. "Security is on their way. I've already informed them of the situation. I'm treating this as an official incident. The courthouse may be closed today, but I assure you my role doesn't end at 5 o'clock. Karen's mouth dropped open, her face a mixture of horror and disbelief. "You're overreacting," she hissed. "You're just trying to humiliate me." Marla arched one perfectly shaped eyebrow. "No, Karen. You've done that all by yourself." Karen tried to laugh, a brittle, humorless sound, and began to backpedal, her heels clicking awkwardly on the stone patio. "Look, I think we all got a little heated. Emotions run high at these kinds of things. I just got caught off guard, that's all. Can we all just calm down and enjoy the party?" She waved a hand around as if to magically rewind time, but it was far too late for reconciliation. The damage had been done, and the entire crowd knew it. Riley, still seated beside me, was recovering slowly, her hand pressed gently to the faint red imprint on her cheek. Her expression was blank, as if she couldn't quite believe what had happened. I kept a steady hand on her back, unsure whether to pull her away or stand firm beside her, but grateful when Marla's gaze softened just slightly as it turned to us. "You're safe here," she said, addressing Riley directly. "You are both welcome in my home. I take full responsibility for not intervening sooner." Her words were not just comforting, they were empowering. They grounded us, restored a piece of the dignity Karen had tried so hard to snatch away. Riley nodded slowly, managing a quiet "thank you," her voice fragile but gaining strength with each syllable. Then came the arrival of security, 2 uniformed officers from the courthouse who approached with professional calm, instantly recognizing Marla and nodding respectfully. Karen's face drained of color as they neared. "Wait, are you serious? This is absurd. You called the actual cops?" she asked, her voice cracking as panic began to seep into every syllable. Marla stepped aside to let them through. "This is not a police matter yet," she clarified. "These men are courthouse security." Given that this incident occurred on the private estate of a sitting judge, adjacent to the courthouse grounds, and that the perpetrator has a known history of disruptive behavior in civil court, I consider this both within their jurisdiction and well within my rights to report. One of the guards addressed Karen directly. "Ma'am, we'll need you to come with us to answer a few questions. You're not under arrest at this time, but if you resist, that may change." Karen's mouth moved, but no sound came out. She looked around one last time as if clinging to the hope that someone, anyone, would step forward and defend her. No one did. The party guests remained quiet, solemn, and stone-faced. If anything, a few began to murmur among themselves, trading stories of past Karen encounters, memories of awkward run-ins and strange comments, all finally making sense in the light of her outburst. Cairn's carefully curated facade of respectability had collapsed in one swift, bitter act of violence. Now, she had nothing left to stand on. With trembling hands, Cairn allowed herself to be escorted toward the front gate. One of the guards remained behind to gather statements, starting with Riley and me. Marla gently guided us to a quieter corner, offering us bottled water and a moment to breathe. The guests began to return to their seats, murmuring in hushed voices, the mood still heavy but shifting, like a wound starting to clot. The baby shower wasn't over, but it had been changed forever. The cake, now ruined in a pastel heap, had been cleared away. New desserts were brought out, and soft music resumed, though it couldn't quite mask the aftershocks of what had happened. "I can't believe she hit me," Riley finally whispered, as if now that Cairn was gone, the weight of it had finally settled in. "I didn't even say anything to her. I didn't do anything wrong." I wrapped an arm around her and pulled her close. "You didn't have to. Some people are just looking for someone to hate, someone to hurt. It was never about what you did. It was about who she decided you were." Marla returned a few minutes later, this time with a gentle smile. "She won't be returning," she said simply. "I'll be filing a formal complaint. I've seen her before in court. She once tried to sue her own sister for emotional trauma because her niece came out. Needless to say, the case was dismissed." Her words were delivered with the same steady grace as before, but now they held a sense of finality, like a judge lowering the gavel. "I want you both to know," she continued, "that my home is a place of respect, no matter what the occasion. You were invited as honored guests, and you will leave with that status intact." Riley smiled for the first time in what felt like hours. "Thank you," she said again, this time with more strength behind it. The guests slowly began to return to the festivities, and as the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the garden in amber light, I realized something important. Cairn had come here thinking she could dominate the room, poison it with her cruelty, and walk away untouched. But what she didn't realize was that she had walked into the wrong garden, under the roof of the wrong woman, surrounded by a crowd that, when finally pushed, had chosen decency over silence. The shift in energy was undeniable. After Cairn was escorted from the garden, and the tension that had gripped the party like a vice finally released its hold, people began to breathe again. The relief was almost palpable, but so was the shame that lingered in the spaces between conversations, in the sideways glances and hushed murmurs that now carried a different tone, one of embarrassment and guilt. It was as though everyone realized at once that they had witnessed something wrong and done far too little about it until it was far too late. The ambient music resumed, but the laughter took time to return. The air was still thick with the residue of what had just happened, and no one could pretend it hadn't. Some guests attempted to return to the rhythm of the celebration by resuming half-finished games or chatting near the snack table, but their words were often punctuated by glances in our direction, not cruel or judgmental, but uncertain, like they weren't sure if they should apologize, comfort us, or simply leave us be. Riley stood beside me now, her posture more upright than before, not in a defensive way but as someone who had been through a storm and come out on the other side with the quiet clarity of knowing her own strength. Her cheek was still pink, but the redness had started to fade, and in its place was the beginning of something else: resolve. She held her drink with a steady hand and even smiled at a young girl who approached with a baby shower game card, nervously offering her a chance to join in. Riley accepted the card and thanked her, and the girl's shoulders dropped with relief, as if she'd been afraid we would reject any attempt to bring normalcy back into the space. That was the thing about cruelty in public. It didn't just hurt the person targeted, it forced everyone present into a moral choice, and now they all seemed to be reckoning with which choice they had made. Marla, ever the calm center of the gathering, returned once more, not as a judge or an enforcer, but as a gracious host. She gathered the guests' attention without needing to raise her voice, simply lifting her glass and waiting until the soft murmur fell quiet. "We all witnessed something upsetting today," she said, her voice steady but not devoid of emotion. And while it is not my intention to overshadow the purpose of this event, I think it's important we acknowledge what happened rather than pretend it didn't. Riley and her partner were treated unfairly, unjustly, and cruelly. That is not something I allow under my roof. I invited them here as guests, and I expect every guest to be treated with the dignity they deserve. Her words were met with nods, some murmurs of agreement, and a few claps. This is a celebration of life, of new beginnings, she continued, turning to the expectant parents. And if we are going to welcome a new soul into this world, we ought to make it one worth living in. That means doing better, all of us. There was a beat of silence after she finished speaking, and then something shifted. A middle-aged woman with salt and pepper curls and a kind face walked over to us with moist eyes and gently took Riley's hand. "I should have said something earlier," she said. "I saw what she was doing. I should have stepped in." Riley gave her a small smile, not out of obligation but genuine warmth. "Thank you," she replied, and just like that, the dam began to break. One by one, people came up to us, some apologizing, others thanking us for how gracefully we handled the situation. It wasn't a flood of atonement, but it was enough to feel seen, acknowledged, and perhaps just a little more at ease. We were guided to a new table, one that had been hastily cleaned and reset after the cake incident, and a fresh tray of desserts was brought out, mini fruit tarts, eclairs, lemon bars. Someone even produced a backup cake from the house's kitchen, a simple vanilla affair topped with edible roses and a sign that read, "Welcome, baby." It wasn't as fancy as the original, but it felt more sincere, like a symbol of something restored. I watched Riley take a small bite of a tart and smile, and I felt the knot in my chest begin to loosen. Marissa, Riley's cousin, finally reappeared and rushed to our table with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she said breathlessly. "I had no idea she was going to be here. I didn't even invite her directly. She came as a plus one with one of the in-laws. I would have said something sooner if I'd known what she was doing." Riley shook her head. "It's okay. You don't have to take responsibility for her. I'm just glad it's over." The two of them embraced, and it felt like something that had been broken between them years ago was quietly being repaired. It wasn't dramatic or filled with declarations, just a hug that said, "I'm here," and sometimes that's all healing needs to begin. The rest of the party began to settle into something resembling normal. The games resumed, gifts were opened with laughter and tears, and the parents-to-be were eventually coaxed into a baby name guessing contest that ended in a hilarious debate over whether Peanut could be considered a viable middle name. People began to remember why they had come, to celebrate new life, to connect, to laugh. But underneath it all was a deeper current, one that had been stirred by what happened. Conversations turned a little more thoughtful. Guests who might never have spoken to each other before found themselves bonding over shared experiences, or candidly discussing the importance of standing up against prejudice when they see it. The event had shifted from just a baby shower into something more. It had become a mirror, reflecting not only the joy of new beginnings, but also the hard truths about how we treat one another. As the sun began to dip behind the tall hedges bordering the garden, casting long shadows across the tables, Riley and I stood off to the side, watching the guests, the decorations fluttering gently in the breeze, and the soft clink of glasses and laughter returning in full. It was far from the day we had expected, but in a strange way, it had given us more than we came for. It had reminded us that kindness, while often silent, is stronger than hate when given the chance to speak. It had reminded us that people, though sometimes slow to act, are capable of growth. And it had reminded us that sometimes justice doesn't come with a bang or a gavel. It comes with a quiet phone call, a calm voice, and a woman in pearls who knows exactly when to step in. We didn't need to be rescued, but it felt good to be protected. The late afternoon light melted into golden hour, casting everything in a warm amber glow, softening the edges of the day's earlier tension. By then, most of the guests had begun to relax, the laughter no longer strained, the conversations flowing naturally again, as if the ugliness that had marred the event was slowly being replaced by something gentler, more healing. The backup cake had been sliced. The parents-to-be were surrounded by gifts and smiling wide, and even the children had begun playing again on the grass, their laughter rising and falling like birdsong over the rustle of the trees. Yet for all the restored peace, there was a lingering awareness that something significant had taken place, that this had been more than a simple baby shower. It had become a moment of truth for everyone involved, a reckoning wrapped in pastel decorations and party favors, and its effects ran deeper than the garden's trimmed hedges or its elegant floral centerpieces. Riley and I found ourselves sitting beneath a white trellis wrapped in climbing roses, a spot just far enough from the crowd to feel private, but still close enough to hear the hum of the party. She leaned her head against my shoulder, the tension finally gone from her posture, though her eyes still carried a glimmer of something, sadness perhaps, but also strength. I wrapped an arm around her and watched the light catch in her hair, grateful she had stood her ground, proud of her resilience. There had been moments today when I'd feared she might shatter under the weight of Karen's cruelty, but instead, she had weathered it with a quiet dignity that spoke louder than any outburst could have. What had happened to her had been vile, unprovoked, and violent, but the way she carried herself afterward, calm, composed, even generous with those who came forward to apologize, had shifted something in the people around us. It was like she had peeled back a layer of polite indifference and shown everyone the cost of their silence. Marla approached again as the sky shifted into its dusky hues, her presence as commanding and graceful as ever. She no longer held a wine glass or wore the polite hostess smile she'd carried earlier. Now she looked at us not as guests but as equals, as people who had walked through fire and emerged stronger. She sat down across from us, crossed her legs, and offered a small nod before speaking. "I just got off the phone with courthouse administration," she said plainly, her voice as steady as ever. "There will be a formal complaint filed against Karen. I've already spoken to the witnesses and gathered statements. I've also requested that footage recorded by guests be submitted, with consent, to accompany the report. Based on what I've seen and heard today, I have no doubt charges will be pursued." Riley nodded slowly, digesting the words. "Will she go to jail?" she asked, not out of vengeance but simple curiosity. Marla shrugged lightly. "Assault charges often depend on context, prior behavior, and the willingness of the victim to press charges. But at the very least, she will face consequences. She won't be brushing this under the rug." There was something reassuring about the certainty in Marla's voice, the way she didn't leave room for doubt or loopholes. She didn't embellish or soften the reality. She simply laid it out, like a woman who had long stopped tolerating injustice in any form. Riley looked at her and smiled for real this time, the first genuine one I'd seen since the slap. "Thank you," she said, and Marla returned the smile, small but sincere. "No thanks needed. You handled yourself with more grace than most adults I see in courtrooms." As Marla rose to return to the other guests, she paused, as if considering something. "You know," she said, looking over the garden, "people like Karen rely on the silence of others. It's how they stay comfortable, how they maintain the illusion that their hate is just common sense dressed in tradition. But silence is no longer a defense. Not anymore." She looked back at us then, her eyes sharp and kind all at once. "You didn't ask for this confrontation, but the way you responded, it forced people to make a choice. And they chose right. That matters more than you know." After she left, we sat quietly for a while, letting the sounds of the evening take over, the rustling leaves, the gentle laughter, the soft jazz drifting from the speakers. There was a sense of peace in that moment, a recognition that what we had endured had not broken us. In fact, it had brought something unexpected: connection. Not just between us, but between strangers who had seen something wrong and finally decided to stand on the right side of it. Before we left, the expectant parents approached, their faces glowing from more than just the excitement of the day. The mother-to-be held both our hands, tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry that this happened at our shower," she said softly. "I didn't know her, not really. I wish I had stepped in sooner." Riley squeezed her hand gently and replied, "It wasn't your fault, and we're glad we stayed. Honestly, it made today more real than any shower could have." The father-to-be nodded. Our kid's going to grow up in a better world because of people like you. It was a simple statement, but it landed hard, settling deep in my chest. That's the thing people don't often understand about standing up to hate. It's not always about changing the mind of the person who causes harm. Sometimes, it's about changing the minds of everyone else watching. As we gathered our things and made our way toward the gate, several guests came to say goodbye, offering hugs, warm handshakes, and quiet affirmations. You two take care of each other. I admire how you handled that. You didn't deserve any of it, and I'll remember how you stood your ground. Each word felt like another stitch mending a tear that Karen had tried to rip open. By the time we reached the driveway, the sun had nearly vanished beyond the horizon, casting everything in twilight. We stood for a moment beside the car, letting the cool air wrap around us. Riley looked at me and said, "I thought today was going to be awful, and for a while it was. But it also reminded me that people are capable of change, even if they're slow about it." I nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. And it reminded me that even when it feels like the world isn't watching, someone is. And sometimes they're wearing pearls and know how to make a phone call that changes everything. We laughed, not out of humor but out of relief. The kind of laugh that comes after a storm, when you realize you've made it through intact. We got in the car, started the engine, and pulled away from the estate, leaving behind the garden, the party, and the ghost of a slap that had turned a simple baby shower into a quiet revolution. Karen may have thought she was just expressing her opinion, making a scene to assert her self-importance, but what she didn't know, what she couldn't have anticipated, was that the host of this garden party wasn't just some genteel older woman with expensive shoes and good taste. She was a judge, and she didn't need a robe or a courtroom to deliver justice. She only needed a reason, and Karen gave her one.